Welcome. A Nigeria Governors Forum report is warning that implementing the proposed new minimum wage will lead to an increase in recurrent expenditure, potentially pushing some of Nigerian states into bankruptcy. Now, the report points to Abia State, Ekiti State, Gombe State, Imo State, Katsina State, Kogi State, Oyo State, Plateau State, Sokoto State, Yobe State, and Zamfara states, which were in a deficit in 2022. It means that the expenses outweighed their revenue, and this is due to a burden of recurrent expenditure. The expenses outweighed their revenue. Now, President Bola Tinubu, Nigeria's president, under the auspices of the National Economic Council on Thursday, met with governors of the 36 states, who of course are members of the National Economic Council. Now, the president wasn't meant to be at the Economic Council meeting. That council is chaired by the Vice President of Nigeria traditionally. But the president was there. So he met with the 36 state governors of the Federation, also met with ministers over the new minimum wage demand by organized labor. Don't forget, organized labor is asking for 250,000 naira. Now, this meeting comes because 48 hours earlier, the Federal Executive Council held, this is where the president superintends over, and they were to consider a memo on the new minimum wage, but they voted to step down the consideration of that memo to allow the president consult with the governors of the states and the private sector. So that was why the president met with the National Economic Council. Now, the governors under the aegis of the Nigerian Governors Forum earlier. Now, the FEC meeting was held earlier in the week, and the NEC meeting, National Economic Council, was held on Thursday. But on Wednesday, the Nigerian Governors Forum met in Abuja before the NEC meeting to deliberate on the minimum wage. Now, apart from the NEC, or the National Nigerian Governors Forum, the governors from the southern part of Nigeria under the aegis of the Southern Governors Forum also met. They released a 16-point communique in which they called for the consideration of cost of living and also consideration of the ability of each state to pay the minimum wage in reaching an agreement on a figure, an amount, to be known as the new national minimum wage. Now, the Southern Governors Forum are also advocating that each state negotiate the new minimum wage individually with the labor unions, either collectively or as state chapters of both the NLC and the TUC. Now, what is labor saying? Well, the Nigeria Labour Congress on its part is faulting the claim by the Federal Executive Council that it stepped down the deliberations of the proposals to enable President Bola Tinubu make wider consultations on the issue. Don't forget, the tripartite committee presented the president a report. Now, the NLC is also criticizing the governors for what it calls displaying total ignorance regarding the national minimum wage issue. An official of the Labour Center, that's the NLC, says it is wrong for the governors to assume that the national minimum wage can be negotiated at state level. Well, despite this, Governor of Jigawa State, Umar Namadi, says that his government will negotiate a new minimum wage for workers in his state. He says that his administration will set up its own tripartite committee together with labor and stakeholders in order to agree on a figure. In fact, he says this has been happening for some time now, so it's nothing new in his state. Well, joining us to discuss this very important development, these developments, is a man who is a known name when it comes to commentary on national issues, and he recently wrote an article I read regarding this same minimum wage. I would like to introduce, with all pleasure, Mr. Owei Lakemfa. He's the former Secretary General of the Organization of African Trade Union Unity, OATUU. Sir, it's great to have you on the program tonight. Been enjoying your weekly columns in the Vanguard. Good evening to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you very much. What are your thoughts? Yes. Do you agree that with the governors that approving labor's demand will lead to bankruptcy among some states?
No, I don't. Now, we run a country, and we all knew that the minimum wage will be due for review after 5 years. And so we knew it was coming. So And the negotiations is about discussions, it's about give and take, and agreeing on what is sensible and what is affordable. And that was what happened. For instance, the governors had 6 governors representing them in that negotiation. So if they had any discussions or any proposals, they would have made it there. But they agreed with what went on there. So I don't think there's any problem. And like I said somewhere else, one of the 6 governors there was Chukwuma Soludo, His Excellency, who was governor of Central Bank. So they knew about the figures, they knew everything. So there's nothing, it's like the governors, in my view, are behaving like debtors who promise to pay at the end of the month, and when the month comes, they start scratching their heads.
Interesting.
The minimum wage is a law in Nigeria. And once it is passed, so it is not possible for any governor, after the National Assembly has legislated on the minimum wage, and President Tinubu would have paid, it is not possible for any governor to decide not to pay. That would be unconstitutional.
Okay.
And the governors are sworn to uphold the Nigerian Constitution.
Okay, Owei Lakemfa, we'll come to this issue of the state governors and their part in all of this. But talking about bankruptcy, we've heard that there will be an increase in recurrent expenditure. And if there's no increase in recurrent expenditure, if there's an increase in recurrent expenditure without a concomitant increase in revenue, then of course there's a problem here, isn't there?
Well, as you know, there has been an increase in revenue for all states. But beyond that, in most states, I think, except for Lagos and maybe Rivers State, these are civil servant states. It's only when you pay workers that the economy starts running well. So paying workers is also an empowerment of the people in those states. So when you talk about the economy in every state will have problems unless workers are paid, and workers can then pay rent and can go to the market and pay school fees. Without that, the state will collapse. We don't want to run states without people, human beings.
But where will the money come from? Where will it come from?
Look, my brother, this minimum wage was negotiated, and the governors were there, and they had agreements. Before President Bola Tinubu announced a minimum of 60,000 naira, there had been consultations and agreements. And there's no reason why, if Edo State can pay 70,000 naira, why other states cannot pay 60,000 naira? So this whole thing about bankruptcy and all those things, it has to do with priority. If minimum wage is prioritized, if salaries are prioritized, then you don't have problems. But if you have to pay the expense of governors the way they want, you may just find that there isn't enough money. So it's about priority. And the Constitution says that the reason why we have government is for the welfare of the people and their security. So the governors, in my view, if they put the issue about welfare, first, especially of wages, there will be no problem.
Well, what about the fact that, some states have a different, cost of living? For instance, you can't compare the cost of transportation or rent in Lagos or Abuja to that in Ebonyi or in, I don't know which other state to use, maybe Calabar or Edo State,
Yes.
So how about that?
My brother, I don't know where you live, but the cost of... My brother, I don't know where you live, but the cost of living in Betama is different from the cost of living in Yanyan. So everywhere you have differentials. So minimum wage is minimum, is the base. So that if you have 60,000, 60,000 minimum, whatever figure you arrive at, and the Rivers, Edo decides to pay 70,000, it's okay. So if Zamfara has no money and wants to pay minimum wage, it's okay. But if Akwa Ibom has more money than Zamfara State, and start to pay higher minimum wage, it's okay. But there is a baseline. That's the whole issue. The issue is that there is a minimum below which you cannot go. So if there's a minimum wage, then you have to pay the minimum wage or pay higher than it. So the issue about cost of living is normal. Even in cities, in states, your cost of living that differential everywhere you go to. You get it? So if you live in Isaleko, the cost of living there might be different from the people living in Lekki. But that does not mean that they should not have minimum wage. So Lagos might be higher, talking about cost of living, than Ondo, but that does not mean that the worker in Ondo should not have a minimum wage. But however, the worker in Lagos can have something higher than the minimum wage. So if the minimum wage, for instance, as an example, is 100,000. If Lagos can afford to pay 120, why not? But no state will be allowed to pay below the minimum wage. And don't forget that this is a law. It's part of the constitution. And so, because I had a governor say, vowing that he would not obey the minimum wage act, he has to. He will just be creating problems for himself and the state.
Okay.
And I think that if Lagos, swore by the constitution, to uphold the constitution, they will go against the constitution if they refuse to obey the minimum wage act. They have to.
Okay, but they are calling for a review.
A review of what now?
Of this act, probably to allow for what you called in your article, which I'm looking at, the confederate wage system, like you called it.
There's no act. Huh? No, you can't review what is not in existence. The minimum wage act has not passed. So what are you reviewing? What you have is that there have been negotiations over the month, and there's some consensus. So you cannot review a law that has not been passed. In fact, the very bill has not even got National Assembly. So what they want to review? I don't understand that.
Well, there is already an act in existence, but the president is going to send a bill to the National Assembly because that one has expired. So they want the practice of what has been in law before now, which is through the tripartite committee, to change, whereby the states have their own tripartite committees. For instance, the governor of one of the northern states, Jigawa State, has already said, that's Umar Namadi, that his government is going to set up their own tripartite committee.
No, there's no problem with that. And in fact, states are encouraged to set up their own tripartite committee, provided that they would not pay below the minimum wage. That's the position. That's all. You can pay higher. Look, in 2000, when we had the minimum of 5,500, there are states like Lagos and Akwa Ibom that decided to pay 7,500. So there's nothing wrong with it. So minimum wage is minimum. It is not maximum wage. So if the minimum wage law is passed, you have to obey it. But if you want to pay higher, you are welcome, but you cannot pay lower. So the governor that is talking maybe does not know that it will be violating the Nigerian constitution. And it's not good for a governor who has sworn by the constitution to violate it.
All right, you talked in your article, you talked about, you said the governors need better knowledge of the national minimum wage. In your article today, in today's Vanguard. What exactly were you trying to pass across?
The national minimum wage concept is an international one. It's universal. It is by the International Labour Organization, ILO, which is an arm of the UN. And the ILO was set up in 1919 to say, look, there's going to be a problem in the world if you allow the naked exploitation of human beings. So it has to change. So they decided that there should be a minimum wage in every country, below which people should not be paid. So when you say national minimum wage, it's not Nigeria minimum wage as such. It's a universal minimum wage. Every country has a national minimum wage that is minimum, below which nobody will pay. So when you say minimum wage, it's an international thing. It is not about Nigeria. It is not whether you run a federal system or a confederal system or a unitary system. No, it's not. It's not about federalism. No, it is not. However, where federalism can come in is that if we all agree that the minimum wage is X amount and you want to pay higher, it's okay. So the national minimum wage is not really Nigerian minimum wage. It is an international minimum, universal minimum wage that has been in existence since 1928. While Nigeria was still a colony. That is about almost going to 100 years now. So the national minimum wage is negotiated in every country, taking into consideration the cost of living. And so once that is passed, it is then respected by everybody. And there are conventions on this, like Convention 1987 of the ILO. So the national minimum wage is negotiated by each country for its own purpose, but it's actually an international wage.
All right. Mr. Lakemfa, we'll come back to you in a moment. We'll take a pause now to take some adverts, and when we come back, we'll continue with the conversation. Please stay with us. Welcome back. We still have with us former Secretary General of the Organization of African Trade Union Unity, OATUU, Owei Lakemfa. He joins us right here virtually on Politics HQ. Mr. Lakemfa, let's look at the idea that, you know, the federal government continues to do the work of consulting and negotiating to come to an agreement outside the framework of the tripartite committee. Now, Labour seems to have a problem with that. What are your thoughts on that? Because you're saying that discussing this or considering this, even at the Federal Executive Council level, is illegal and not acceptable.
Well, like I said, the national minimum wage of every country is a domestication of international law. So you domesticate the national minimum wage, you know, in the ILO, in Nigeria, which is what is going on. And the practice is that the tripartite body, that is employers, private employers, the government, and labor, discuss, they meet, they negotiate, and reach a compromise. And then this negotiation, this agreement they've reached, the compromise, is then passed on as executive bill to the National Assembly, which legislates on it. That is the process. So it is not really the business of a president or governor to decide how much is going to be paid, except by negotiation. And this is what I've been doing even from colonial times. You get it? So, what usually will happen is that once, and this is my father, but like I told you, there are 6 governors participating in it, representing the governor. The federal government is chairing it and has a number of people there. Labour is represented by the NLC and TUC. And of course, there is the organized private sector, mainly represented by NECA. So once these negotiations are done, you need to reach a compromise. And that compromise is then presented as an executive bill. It's not about President Tinubu, no, it's not. It's about government, you know, presenting an executive bill to the National Assembly. That is how things are done. So it is not an award. It's not about the governor giving an award to say, okay, I dash you this. No, it's not.
So would it have been wrong?
Negotiation. No.
Okay. Would it have been wrong for the Federal Executive Committee Council to have entertained and considered the memo on national minimum wage like they wanted to do on Monday without stepping it down?
Well, if the effect, we have to decide on that, then it will be a negation of negotiations, or tripartite negotiations. Because the effect is also part of the negotiation. I don't know whether I get the point. The federal government, the executive, are part of negotiation, the governors are part of negotiations, labor is part of negotiations, and the employers are part of negotiations. So the usual thing is to reach a compromise and present it. So it is not what the FEC will need to meet about and discuss. It is not. It is a consensus that is then passed on as executive bill and which is now legislated upon by the National Assembly with the President signing. That's the procedure.
You talked about the fact, you said actually that the governors who are part of, the 6 governors who are part of this tripartite committee had not exactly covered themselves in glory. But I want to take your thoughts on the overall work of the tripartite committee, which, like you said, has representatives from the federal government, state governments. You have the organized private sector and labor represented by NLC, TUC, and NOGE. That committee was inaugurated early this year in January, but had only about 6 or 7 meetings up till June when they went on strike. And after the strike, the president ordered them to meet regularly. Looking at all that has happened, do you think the committee really was able to do a thorough work and justify the amount of money spent in inaugurating them?
That is the best we have. You get it? The federal government decided on who will represent it. The state government decided on who will represent them. Labor decided on who will represent it, and the employers, foreign employers, decided on who will represent them. It's a democratic process, and that's the best we have. And I think, they have worked well. They have tried.
Okay.
It is not left for the National Assembly to do its work.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting. With your experience on the African front and internationally, is there a mechanism or a methodology or a process that can be put in place, a framework, to ensure that this minimum wage change or adjustment happens seamlessly? Because the minimum wage previous one expired a couple of months ago, and we're still talking. Is there a way or a framework that can be put in place to ensure that we don't have to wait, that before you get there, everything is done?
There's already a framework, and this framework was established in 1928. So that's a framework. So this tripartite body you have is a framework. And once people meet and discuss and agree, it will be seamless. What may not be seamless is if there are people who say they will not obey the law. That's a different thing. But there is already a framework.
But this tripartite committee allows for a lot of stagnation, disagreement, and strike. Is there a way we could have a calculation, looking at the cost of living minus something plus something divided by something, and we just calculate the minimum wage and that's it? So spending 500 million naira to inaugurate a committee.
No. Don't look at the amount spent, really. Look at the reason for it and the results that you have. You get it? Now, when you have a tripartite committee, as you've had in Nigeria now, everybody will come with his own figures. And the figures will be determined by the cost of living. So you want to say, look, there's cost of transportation. What do you need? Minimum. What would you need to feed a family of 4? That is the worker, the spouse, and 4 children. How much will you need to pay for health care services, for education? So these are things that are calculated by each group. So government, we say governors met and decided on their own calculation. Labor did, and the employers did. Then you come together as a body to negotiate, give and take, and then reach a consensus. And this consensus is then passed to the executive to sign executive bill, the National Assembly. And once the National Assembly passes it, it then comes for the president for assent. That's all. It's a seamless system, but it can be complicated by human beings.
Interesting. All right, a final question, the big one. You're a man of many years' experience. You've been in the African Trade Union, unity. How much should be Nigeria's new national minimum wage?
let me tell you, no matter how much you pay as minimum wage, it will never be enough. That is why minimum wage is not a component, of a social system. For instance, if you provide free education, you provide mass housing, you provide free health services, then it will be easier for the person on minimum wage to take care of himself and his family. So minimum wage is just an aspect. You get it? So you don't say because you pay minimum wage, then everything will go up. No. So there is a social system. And part of that social system is the minimum wage. And so if the government we have, including the federal government, abide by the constitution that says the reason why we have government is the welfare of the people. If you provide for this welfare, then you find that you need less money as minimum wage. But we don't provide for it, and people are allowed to be exploited, and inflation is allowed to be hyper, then you have problems about minimum wage. For instance, if in 2010 to 2015, the minimum wage was 18,000 naira, and you bought a bag of rice for 7,000 naira, and today the bag of rice is 80,000 naira, then there's a problem.
All right.
That is the problem that we're facing.
Okay. Interesting. Owei Lakemfa, it's always a pleasure having you. I hope the governors will read your article in today's Vanguard and take some stock from it, or take one or two things from it. Hopefully we get a result going forward. But thank you very kindly for your time tonight.
Thank you very much.